The rain didn't fall, it assaulted. Sheets of water hammered the roof of the dark sedan, each drop a tiny fist against the metal. Here, on a forgotten mountain road in North Georgia, the world had been reduced to three things: the suffocating scent of pine and wet earth, the relentless drumming of the storm, and the dead weight in the trunk. Simone Dubois stood behind the car, her hands flat against the cold, slick lid of the trunk. Mud, slick and greedy, tried to claim her designer boots, sucking at them with every shift of her weight. Her black trench coat, once a symbol of her put-together life in Alpharetta, was now just a sodden shroud. Every muscle in her body screamed. For 2 days, adrenaline had been a cruel master, pushing her past the limits of exhaustion. But now, it was abandoning her. Her arms trembled, not from the cold, but from a weariness that had settled deep in her bones. This was the final act. One hard push. That's all it would take. The car was in neutral, the handbrake released. Below the crumbling asphalt shoulder was a sheer drop, a black void filled with the sound of rushing water and the splintering of unseen trees. Gravity would be her accomplice, the car her husband's tomb, the crash his final fabricated story. He did this, she thought, the words a silent mantra against the storm's fury. He brought this hell to our door. The memory of his face, the casual cruelty in his confession, was a fresh brand on her soul. It was the only thing giving her strength. She took a deep, ragged breath that tasted of rain and regret, bent her knees, and braced herself. The metal groaned under her palms as she began to push. The car, heavy and obstinate, shifted an inch, then another. The rear wheels were now perilously close to the edge, teetering over the abyss. This was the point of no return. A place beyond love, beyond vows, beyond the life she had so meticulously built. The life of Simone Dubois, RN, wife, homeowner, a pillar of quiet success in a world that always demanded more from a woman like her. A world that watched her every move, waiting for a crack in the perfect facade. Now, the facade was gone, shattered into a million pieces, and she was here, a murderer in a storm, trying to hurl the evidence of her sin into oblivion. She closed her eyes, summoning the last of her strength. She pictured his smile, the one that used to make her heart flutter, now a venomous sneer in her memory. She pictured the positive test result, the 2 pink lines that had signed her death warrant, or so it had felt. Her rage, a white-hot core in the center of her chest, flared. She let out a guttural cry, a sound torn from the depths of her being, and threw her entire body into the push. The car lurched forward, the back wheels slipped off the asphalt, spinning uselessly in the air. It was happening. It was almost over. A strange, terrifying sense of release washed over her. The secret, the body, the burden, it would all be swallowed by the mountain. She gave one last, desperate shove. And that's when the world exploded in light. Not lightning, but a blinding, strobing glare of red and blue that painted the trees, the rain, and her own horrified face in garish, artificial color. It pulsed against the back of the sedan, freezing her in place like a startled animal, a police car. It had appeared from nowhere, its engine silent until now, a predator that had been stalking her in the darkness all along. For a heartbeat, the world was utterly silent, save for the rain. Simone's hands were still pressed against the trunk, her body locked in a final, futile push. She was caught. Everything, the planning, the cleaning, the horror, the exhaustion, it had all been for nothing. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat as a voice, amplified and metallic, cut through the storm. "Freeze! Step away from the vehicle with your hands in the air." 72 hours earlier, the only storm in Simone's life was in a teacup. The morning sun of Alpharetta, Georgia, streamed through the plantation shutters of her kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fairies. It was a kitchen ripped from a magazine, gleaming quartz countertops, stainless steel sub-zero appliances, and a vase of fresh peonies on the island. This was her sanctuary, the heart of the 4,000-square-foot home she and Andre had built together. It was a testament to their success, a fortress of achievement for a black couple in a neighborhood of old money and new tech wealth. Today was her 45th birthday, and the air was thick with the sweet promise of vanilla and sugar as she whisked the batter for her own cake. A small radio played old-school R&B, and Simone hummed along, her movements graceful and practiced. She was a woman who radiated competence. As a registered nurse at one of Atlanta's top hospitals, she managed life-and-death situations with a calm that soothed patients and impressed doctors. That same control defined her life. Her lawn was perfectly manicured, her social calendar was balanced, and her marriage was 17 years old. Lately, there had been cracks, not chasms, just hairline fractures she tried to ignore. Andre, Dre, as she called him, had been distant. He was a security consultant for a high-end mall in Buckhead, a job that came with late nights, but recently the late nights had become later. His phone guarded more closely, his touch less frequent. She'd told herself it was stress, a midlife slump. Nothing a romantic birthday dinner couldn't fix. He had promised he'd be home early, with a special gift he swore would blow her mind. She slid the cake into the oven and leaned against the counter, surveying her kingdom. From the outside, they were the couple everyone wanted to be, the Dubois family. Successful, elegant, proof that the American dream was accessible to anyone who worked hard enough. But Simone knew the truth. In a place like Alpharetta, you couldn't just be successful. You had to be flawless. She'd felt the subtle sting of racism, disguised as curiosity, questions about where she grew up, surprise compliments on how articulate she was. The way neighbors' eyes would linger on Andre's customized Escalade a second too long. The pressure to be perfect was a constant low-grade hum in the background of her life. The landline phone, a quaint affectation she insisted on keeping, chirped from its cradle on the wall. She wiped her hands on her apron, a faint smile on her face, expecting a birthday call from her mother in Savannah. Dubois residence, she answered, her voice warm. Mrs. Simone Dubois? The voice on the other end was female, professional, and devoid of warmth. This is she. Mrs. Dubois, this is Dr. Alistair's office from the Emory Clinic. We need you to come in. Your test results from your physical last week are back. Simone's heart did a little stutter step. She was the picture of health. Is everything all right? You can just tell me over the phone. A pause stretched across the line, heavy and ominous. The silence was worse than any words. In that moment, the sunlit kitchen felt a little colder, the shadows in the corners a little deeper. The joyful music from the radio seemed to mock her. We really can't discuss this over the phone, Mrs. Dubois, the nurse said, her voice softening with practiced sympathy that only made things worse. Dr. Alistair would like to speak with you in person as soon as possible. Can you come in this afternoon? This wasn't about high cholesterol. This wasn't about a vitamin deficiency. This was the kind of call you saw in movies, the one that came right before the world fell apart. Her mind raced. What could it be? She was meticulous about her health. She never smoked, drank only socially, exercised 3 times a week. It made no sense. I'll be there at 2, she whispered, her throat suddenly tight. She hung up the phone, her hand lingering on the receiver. The smell of the cake baking in the oven was suddenly cloying, nauseating. She walked to the large bay window that overlooked her pristine backyard, the emerald lawn, the sparkling saltwater pool. It all looked unreal, like a set for a play in which she was the star, and she had just forgotten her lines. For 17 years, her only partner had been Andre. For 17 years, she had been faithful, trusting. A cold, slithering dread began to coil in her stomach. The cracks she had been ignoring suddenly seemed to widen, threatening to swallow her whole. The doctor's serious tone, the refusal to speak over the phone, it could only mean one thing. And if it was that one thing, how? The clinic's counseling room was painted a sterile, calming shade of beige that did nothing to calm Simone. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and unspoken grief. Dr. Alistair, a kind-faced man who had been her physician for years, looked at her with an expression of profound pity that made her want to scream. Simone, he began, his voice gentle. The initial ELISA test came back positive. We ran the Western blot test to confirm it. I'm so sorry. The result is positive for HIV. The letters HIV hung in the air, sharp and deadly. Simone stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. It felt like he was speaking a foreign language, a mistake. It had to be a mistake. She was a nurse. She knew the risks, the transmission vectors. She didn't use IV drugs. She had no tattoos from shady parlors. She hadn't had a blood transfusion since she was a child. How? The word was a dry rasp. Dr. Allister slid a box of tissues across the table. That's something we need to discuss. Your husband, has he been tested? The mention of Andre shattered her denial. The cold dread from the morning crystallized into a jagged shard of ice in her gut. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the growing distance. It wasn't a midlife crisis. It was a betrayal of the most intimate and devastating kind. The drive home was a blur. She gripped the steering wheel of her Lexus, the knuckles of her gloved hands white. The perfect houses of Alpharetta seemed to mock her, their cheerful mailboxes and manicured lawns hiding secrets just as dark as the one she now carried in her blood. When Andre walked through the door that evening, he was all smiles. He held a ridiculously large bouquet of roses and a gift bag from Tiffany & Co. "Happy birthday, beautiful," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. He stopped short when he saw her face. She was standing in the living room, motionless, her expression as cold and hard as the marble floors. "What's wrong, baby? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I went to the doctor today, Dre," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I got a call about my physical." She watched him, her nurse's eyes cataloging every micro-expression, the flicker of his eyelids, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his smile faltered for just a second before being plastered back on. He knew. "I have HIV, Andre." The color drained from his face. The roses slipped from his grasp, scattering crimson petals across the pristine floor like drops of blood. It must be a mistake," he stammered, taking a step back. "Was it a mistake when you slept with her, Dre? Was it a mistake when you came home and slept with me?" Her voice rose, cracking with a pain so immense it felt like it was tearing her apart. "Who is she?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. And in that moment, she knew her 17-year marriage was a lie. Her world wasn't just cracking, it had been pulverized. "Tell me her name," she shrieked, the sound raw and animalistic. He flinched. "Chloe," he mumbled. "Chloe Kim, she's a manager at the Apple store." Simone felt a bitter laugh escape her. A young, pretty manager. Of course. How cliché. "Did you know, Dre? Did you know you were sick?" He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a pathetic mix of fear and self-pity. I had a feeling. I got sick a few months ago, like a bad flu. I didn't get tested. I didn't want to know." "You didn't want to know?" she repeated, incredulous. "So you just rolled the dice with my life? You played Russian roulette with my body?" She took a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "You gave me a death sentence for my 45th birthday." "It's not a death sentence anymore, Simone. There's medication." "Shut up!" She lunged, her control finally snapping. She beat her fists against his chest, a torrent of heartbroken rage pouring out of her. He grabbed her wrists, his grip surprisingly strong. "Stop it! Calm down! Calm down!" she screamed, struggling against him. "You've ruined my life." He shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, her head cracking against the sharp edge of the fireplace mantel. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and a searing pain shot through her skull. She crumpled to the floor, dazed. Through the haze of pain, she saw him standing over her, his expression not of concern, but of contempt. "You see?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "This is what you get for being so damn naive. You thought our perfect little life was real?" That was it, the final blow. It wasn't just the disease or the infidelity, it was the contempt, the utter lack of remorse. Something inside her, the calm, competent nurse, the loving wife, died in that instant. All that was left was a primal, all-consuming rage. She scrambled to her feet. He was turning to walk away, dismissing her. In the kitchen, the block of Wusthof knives sat on the counter, gleaming under the recessed lighting. Her feet moved without conscious thought. Her hand closed around the familiar weight of the 8-inch chef's knife. He heard her coming and turned, his eyes widening in alarm. "Simone, what are you doing? Put that down." But she didn't hear him. All she heard was the roaring in her ears. All she saw was the man who had destroyed her. He reached for her, and she reacted. The first thrust was clumsy, driven by pure rage. and it caught him in the shoulder. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, but the second was precise, a nurse's knowledge guiding the blade, and it sank deep into his abdomen. His eyes locked on hers, a look of shocked disbelief spreading across his face. He gasped, a wet, gurgling sound, and began to slump to the floor. The Tiffany bag fell beside him, the little blue box inside a final, bitter insult. The roaring in Simone's ears subsided, replaced by the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. Andre lay on the floor, a growing pool of dark blood spreading across the expensive Turkish runner in the hallway. The chef's knife was still in her hand, its weight a horrific alien thing. For a few seconds she was paralyzed, a spectator to her own nightmare. The part of her brain that was a nurse was screaming, "Apply pressure, call 911, check for a pulse." But the part of her that was a murderer was silent, cold, and terrifyingly clear. There was no going back. Calling 911 would mean a life sentence. Her life, the one she had painstakingly built, was over. But another life, the life of a fugitive, a survivor, was just beginning. And it began with cleaning up the mess. Panic gave way to a chilling, methodical calm. Her medical training, which had once been a source of pride and healing, was now her most valuable criminal tool. She knew about evidence. She knew about DNA, about forensics, about what the police would look for. Her first move was to lock the front door and draw all the curtains, plunging the house into a dim, funereal twilight. She stripped off her own clothes, which were spattered with blood, and put on a pair of Andre's old sweatpants and a t-shirt. Then she went to the laundry room and pulled on a pair of thick yellow rubber gloves. The body was the immediate problem. She couldn't leave it in the main hallway. With a strength born of pure desperation, she grabbed an old, thick blanket from the linen closet. Rolling Andre's heavy, lifeless body onto it was a gruesome, physically taxing ordeal. His eyes were open, staring at the vaulted ceiling with that same look of disbelief. She couldn't bear it. With a trembling hand, she reached out and closed them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. She dragged the body, wrapped in the blanket, through the house and into the attached garage, leaving a sickening smear on the hardwood floors and the now ruined runner. She left him on the cold concrete floor, a temporary solution, and closed the door. Then, the real work began. The cleanup. She was no longer a grieving widow or a terrified woman. She was a decontamination specialist at a biohazard site. From under the sink, she pulled out bleach, ammonia, and hydrogen peroxide. She knew not to mix bleach and ammonia, a rookie mistake. She would use them sequentially. First, she tackled the pools of blood on the hardwood, using paper towels to soak up the excess before starting with soap and water. Then moving on to a diluted bleach solution, she scrubbed until her shoulders ached, the acrid smell of chlorine burning her nostrils. The blood spatter on the wall near the fireplace was harder. Tiny, almost invisible droplets had sprayed in an arc. She wiped them down, but she knew about luminol. She knew that even the most thorough cleaning could leave a ghostly trace. She made a mental note to paint over that section of the wall tomorrow. The Turkish runner was a lost cause. It had been a housewarming gift from her parents, a rich tapestry of reds and blues. Now, it was a giant, grotesque piece of evidence. Trying to clean it would be futile. The blood would have soaked deep into the fibers. With a pair of heavy-duty shears from the garage, she began the laborious task of cutting the expensive rug into small, manageable squares, stuffing them into thick black contractor bags. It felt like she was dismembering a part of her old life, piece by bloody piece. She worked for hours, a grim, silent automaton. She bleached the floor, the wall, the knife, the doorknobs. She found a tiny bloodstain on her own discarded shoe and scrubbed it furiously before bagging the shoes with her clothes. She thought about everything he had touched when he came in. The doorknob, the light switch. She wiped them all down. She vacuumed the entire downstairs area, emptying the canister into another trash bag. She wanted to erase him. Erase what had happened. By the time she was finished, the sun was rising. The house smelled sterile, like a hospital ward after a deep clean. Except for the faint coppery tang of blood that she imagined was still lingering in the air, a ghost of her crime. She peeled off the rubber gloves and took the longest, hottest shower of her life, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, as if she could wash the sin off herself. Stepping out of the steam-filled bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror. A stranger stared back at her. Her eyes were hollow, her face a mask of exhaustion and horror. Her 45th birthday, the day she became a murderer. She walked back into the pristine living room. The scattered rose petals were still on the floor, the only remaining evidence of the life she had had just yesterday. She knelt and began picking them up, one by one. Their vibrant red, a mocking reminder of the blood she had just spent all night cleaning. It was then she realized the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the blood or the body. It was her. For the next 24 hours, Simone existed in a fog of sleepless terror. The house, once her sanctuary, had become her prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of panic through her. The body was still in the garage. Even in the cool autumn weather of Georgia, she knew it was a ticking clock. Decomposition was an enemy she couldn't scrub away with bleach. The solution was in the basement. A large, white chest freezer, bought years ago for storing bulk meats and Thanksgiving turkeys, sat humming quietly in the corner. It was mostly empty now, a relic of a time when she'd hosted large family gatherings. Now, it would have a new, gruesome purpose. Getting Andre's body down the narrow basement stairs was a feat of nightmarish engineering. He was a big man, and post-mortem rigidity had begun to set in. She couldn't just drag the blanket-wrapped bundle. Using a dolly she found in the garage, she managed to wrestle him to the top of the stairs. The descent was a controlled fall, a clumsy, terrifying sequence of bumps and thuds that echoed through the silent house. She worked in the dark, using only a small flashlight, terrified a neighbor might see a light on in the basement at this odd hour. The freezer was large, but not large enough for a fully extended body. A fresh wave of nausea and horror washed over her as she realized what she had to do. With a sickening crack, she was forced to break his limbs to fold him into a grotesque fetal position. It was the most monstrous thing she had ever done, and a part of her mind detached, observing her actions with a cold, clinical horror. She was no longer dealing with her husband, the man she had loved. She was processing a specimen. She packed him in, layering bags of frozen vegetables around him to disguise the shape, and slammed the lid shut. The humming of the freezer's compressor was the only sound in the basement, a low, constant drone that sounded like a death rattle. She spent the rest of the day creating her story. She took Andre's phone, which he'd dropped during the struggle, and sent a text to Chloe Kim. "I need space. Don't contact me." Then she powered it down and removed the SIM card. She took his wallet and his car keys. In the dead of night, she drove his Escalade to a long-term parking lot at the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, leaving it among the thousands of other anonymous vehicles. She took a rideshare back, the driver's cheerful chatter about the weather grating on her raw nerves. The next morning, she called his work. Her voice trembled convincingly as she explained that they had had a terrible fight. "He packed a bag and left," she sobbed into the phone. "He said he was going away for a while to clear his head. I don't know where he went." It was a plausible story. A marriage in crisis, a husband running from his mistakes. She was the wronged wife, deserving of sympathy. She was just finishing her performance, dabbing at crocodile tears, when the doorbell rang. Her blood ran cold. It was too soon. No one should be here. She smoothed her hair, composed her face into a mask of weary grief, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a woman standing on her porch. She was black, around Simone's age, dressed in a sharp, practical blazer. She wasn't a neighbor with a casserole. She had the unmistakable air of authority. Beside her stood a younger white male officer, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. Simone's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, pasted on a look of tired confusion, and opened the door. "Mrs. Simone Dubois?" the woman asked. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and they seemed to see right through Simone's carefully constructed facade. "Yes, I'm Detective Renee Hayes, Alpharetta PD. This is Officer Miller." Her gaze was unwavering. "We received a call from a Ms. Chloe Kim. She was concerned about your husband, Andre Dubois. She said he missed a meeting and wasn't answering his phone. May we come in?" Simone's mind raced. Chloe, of course. The mistress, playing the part of the concerned party. She had to let them in. Refusing would be the guiltiest move of all. "Of course, detective. Please," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. She stepped aside, her hand clutching her robe at her throat. "Anything to help find him. Detective Hayes stepped into the foyer, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the expensive art, the faint, lingering scent of bleach. Simone saw a flicker of something in her expression, not just professional assessment, but a kind of recognition. It was the look of one black woman sizing up another in a space where they were a rarity. Officer Miller, however, looked around with a less nuanced curiosity, his eyes lingering on the price tags he was surely imagining. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Dubois," Detective Hayes said, her voice neutral. "Thank you," Simone managed. "Ms. Kim mentioned you and your husband had an argument," Hayes continued, getting straight to the point. "Can you tell me what happened?" Simone launched into her rehearsed story, the tears coming easily now. She told them about the fight, the confession of infidelity, omitting the HIV diagnosis for now, and Andre storming out. Hayes listened patiently, her expression giving nothing away. "And you have no idea where he might have gone?" "None. He just said he needed to get away." The detective walked slowly through the living room, her eyes missing nothing. She stopped near the fireplace, her gaze falling on the wall beside the mantel. Simone's heart stopped. Had she missed a spot? Was there a faint brown stain only a trained eye could see? Hayes didn't say anything. She just looked at the wall for a long moment before turning her piercing gaze back to Simone. "It's just... we're very worried," Simone added, trying to fill the heavy silence. "I'm sure you are," Detective Hayes said softly. The words were sympathetic, but her eyes were not. They were cold, calculating, and filled with a terrifying, unspoken suspicion. And in that moment, Simone knew this was not a routine visit. This was the beginning of a hunt, and she was the prey. The living room, usually a place of comfort and pride, felt like an interrogation chamber. Simone sat on her plush velvet sofa, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Across from her, Detective Renee Hayes sat in an armchair, a leather-bound notebook open on her lap. She projected an aura of calm authority that was far more intimidating than Officer Miller's bored, watchful presence by the door. "So, he just walked out? With a single bag?" Hayes asked, her pen poised. "It was all very fast," Simone said, her voice carefully modulated to sound shaky but not hysterical. "He was angry. I was devastated. He just threw some things in his duffel bag and left." "Did he take his car?" Here it was, the first real test. "Yes, the Escalade. It's gone." Hayes made a note. "And his wallet? His phone?" "I assume so. I haven't seen them." Another lie, smooth as silk. The detective's eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, never left Simone's face. It felt like she was undergoing an MRI, every layer of her being scanned and analyzed. "Mrs. Dubois, Ms. Kim also mentioned something else. Something about Andre being unwell recently. She was worried about his health." Simone's carefully constructed composure threatened to crack. Chloe knew more than she thought. This was a minefield. Admitting the truth about the HIV would give her a powerful motive for rage, solidifying her story about the fight. But it would also expose the deepest, most humiliating secret of her life to these strangers. She made a split-second decision. Vulnerability was her best defense. She let out a long, shuddering breath, and the tears she summoned were tinged with real pain. "He confessed something else to me, Detective. The reason for our fight, it was more than just an affair." She looked Hayes in the eye. "He told me he had contracted HIV and that he had passed it to me." The effect was immediate. Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. Detective Hayes' professional mask softened for the first time, replaced by a flicker of genuine empathy. In that moment, they were no longer just cop and suspect. They were two black women, navigating a world that often dealt them the cruelest hands. Hayes understood the depth of that betrayal in a way Miller never could. "I am so very sorry to hear that, Mrs. Dubois," Hayes said, and for the first time, Simone felt the words were sincere. "That must have been incomprehensible." "It was," Simone whispered, burying her face in her hands. "I felt like my life was over." She had given them the perfect motive. A woman scorned, terrified, and facing a life-altering illness. Her rage would be understandable. A violent fight that ended with him walking out? It was entirely believable. They talked for another 20 minutes. Hayes asked for names of Andre's friends, family, places he might go. Simone answered truthfully. knowing none of them would have heard from him. She was the perfect picture of a wronged, cooperative wife. As Hayes and Miller prepared to leave, the detective paused at the door. "We'll put out a bolo. Be on the lookout for his vehicle. We'll check the airport lots, bus stations." She handed Simone her card. "If he contacts you, or if you remember anything else, anything at all, you call me, day or night." "I will, detective. Thank you." Hayes nodded, her expression once again professionally neutral. But just as she was about to turn away, her eyes drifted down the hallway, past the living room, to the spot where the Turkish runner used to be. The hardwood floors were bare, gleaming under the recessed lighting. "That's a beautiful floor," Hayes commented casually. "Did you just have it refinished?" Simone's blood turned to ice water. The question was a scalpel, disguised as small talk. "Oh no," she said, forcing a light laugh. "I've been meaning to. We had a runner there, but our dog, he ruined it last week. A house training accident." They didn't have a dog. It was a weak, stupid lie, and she knew it the second it left her lips. Detective Hayes' expression didn't change. She just nodded slowly. "I see," she said, but her eyes told a different story. They said, "I don't believe you." They said, "There's something wrong here." They said, "I'll be back." The moment the door closed, Simone sagged against it, her body trembling. She had survived the first encounter, but she hadn't fooled Detective Hayes. Not for a second. The detective's final question wasn't about the floor. It was a message, a warning. The hunt was on, and the detective was patient. Simone ran to the window and watched the squad car pull away. She knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. Her perfect house, with its gleaming floors and dark secrets, was now the center of a murder investigation, and Detective Hayes would not rest until she unearthed the truth buried beneath the surface. 3 days later, they came back. Simone had been living on a knife's edge, starting at every sound, obsessively recleaning surfaces that were already sterile. She had painted the wall by the fireplace a slightly different shade of eggshell, a subtle mistake she prayed no one would notice. Her carefully constructed world was a house of cards, and Detective Hayes was the wind. This time, Hayes wasn't alone. She arrived with 2 uniformed officers and a man in a K9 unit jumpsuit. At his side, straining at a leash, was a magnificent German shepherd, its coat a glossy black and tan. The dog's name was Kaiser, and its intelligent eyes seemed to fixate on Simone with an unnerving intensity. They had a warrant. "A search warrant, Mrs. Dubois," Hayes said, her tone polite but firm. It was not a request. A judge agreed that the inconsistencies in your timeline and the lack of any electronic footprint from your husband since his disappearance give us probable cause. Simone's heart hammered against her ribs, but she projected an air of weary resignation. "A warrant? Detective, I've told you everything." "It's just procedure," Hayes said, though they both knew it was a lie. They fanned out through the house, a methodical and invasive force. Simone was instructed to sit at her kitchen island while they worked. It was psychological torture. She watched as they opened her closets, rifled through her drawers, looked under her bed. It was a violation of her sanctuary, a systematic dismantling of her privacy. But the real terror began when the K9 handler, Officer Davies, brought Kaiser into the main hallway. The dog began to work, its nose to the ground, sniffing in a zigzag pattern. Simone held her breath. She had used gallons of bleach, vinegar, and hydrogen peroxide. She had scrubbed until her fingers were raw. No human could possibly detect what had happened there. But Kaiser wasn't human. As the German shepherd reached the spot where the runner had been, its behavior changed. It stopped, its tail went rigid, and it began to whine, a low, guttural sound. It circled the area, sniffing intently, its paws scratching at the pristine hardwood floors. "What is it, boy?" Davies murmured. "He's alerting on something," Davies called out to Hayes, who was watching from the doorway, her arms crossed. "Residual scent of a cleaning agent, maybe, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Simone felt the blood drain from her face. "It's just the bleach," she told herself. "He's reacting to the chemicals." Davies led the dog through the rest of the house. Kaiser gave the fireplace wall a cursory sniff, but moved on. Then they approached the door to the basement. It was locked. "Ma'am, we need the key for this door," one of the officers said. "It's just the basement," Simone said, trying to keep her voice steady. Storage, a circuit breaker box. Kaiser was now frantic. He was pawing at the base of the door, barking, sharp, insistent barks that echoed through the house. The sound was a death knell. The dog seems to think there's more than just storage down there, Hayes said, her voice devoid of emotion. Simone's hands trembled as she retrieved the key from a hook in the kitchen. She felt a dozen eyes on her as she unlocked the door. The moment it was open, Kaiser tried to bolt down the stairs, held back only by Davies's firm grip on his leash. The basement was cool and smelled faintly of damp concrete and laundry detergent. And, to Simone's horror, a faint, almost imperceptible, sweet, cloying odor she hadn't noticed before. The smell of the very beginning of decay, masked but not eliminated by the freezer's low temperature. Davies let Kaiser lead. The dog went straight to the large chest freezer, the one that hummed its low, monotonous song in the corner. Kaiser began barking furiously, scratching at the white enamel lid, his excitement uncontrollable. "Steady, boy," Davies commanded, pulling him back. Hayes walked over and stood before the freezer, looking from it to Simone. The silence was deafening, broken only by Kaiser's whining and the hum of the compressor. This was it, the end of the line. They would open it, and her secret would be laid bare. "What's in the freezer, Mrs. Dubois?" Hayes asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Food," Simone choked out. "Frozen meat, vegetables. We bought it for entertaining." Hayes looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. Simone could see the gears turning in her mind. The dog had alerted. The smell was faint but strange. The wife was lying. But a warrant to search the contents of a freezer might require more specifics than the one she had. Forcing it open without that could risk having the evidence thrown out of court. Hayes was a good detective. She played by the book. She turned to Davies. "Bag what he's scratching at. Take a swab of the door seals. We'll see what the lab says." She then turned back to Simone, her eyes hard as diamonds. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Dubois." They left. They hadn't opened the freezer. Simone had been given a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution, but as she locked the basement door behind them, she knew it was only a matter of time. The dog had told them the secret. Kaiser had sniffed out the truth through layers of steel, insulation, and bleach. Detective Hayes didn't have proof yet, but she had certainty, and she would be back. The canine witness had spoken, and its testimony was a death sentence. The visit from the K9 unit changed everything. The game of cat and mouse was over. Simone was now living in a state of siege. She felt Detective Hayes' presence everywhere, an unseen weight on her shoulders. She started noticing things. A nondescript sedan parked down the street for hours at a time, the faint click on her landline when she made a call. She was being watched. The investigation was closing in on her from all sides, a tightening net of circumstantial evidence. Detective Hayes was meticulous. She re-interviewed Chloe Kim, who, in a tearful confession, provided a detail Simone hadn't counted on. Andre had been terrified of his diagnosis. "He said he was worried Simone would kill him if she found out," Chloe claimed, a self-serving statement that painted Andre as a victim and Simone as a potential threat. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Then came the neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a retired woman with nothing better to do than watch the neighborhood from her front window, came forward. She told the police about the odd commotion she'd heard on the night of Simone's birthday. More damningly, she mentioned seeing Simone's garage door open around 3 a.m. a couple of nights later. "She was wrestling with something," Mrs. Gable had said, her voice full of righteous suspicion. "A large rolled-up rug. She put it in the back of her Lexus. I thought it was very strange, throwing out a perfectly good rug in the middle of the night." Every piece of the puzzle Hayes collected pointed back to Simone. The bolo on the Escalade had come up empty. No sign of it at the airport, no toll road pings, no traffic camera hits. It had vanished, which Hayes found far more suspicious than if it had been found abandoned. A man running away still needs to drive. A man who never left. His car would have to be hidden. The final crucial piece came from the forensics lab. The swabs from the basement freezer had come back inconclusive, the bleach having done its job too well. But the fragments from Kaiser's scratching at the hardwood floor were another story. Deep within the tongue and groove seam of one of the planks, the lab found a microscopic speck of blood that Simone's frantic cleaning had missed. It wasn't enough to get a full DNA profile, but it was type O positive, Andre's blood type. It was the physical evidence Hayes needed. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to convince a judge that the house was a crime scene. Still, Hayes was patient. She didn't want to go to court with just a speck of blood and a suspicious dog. She wanted a body. She believed Simone was panicking, that the pressure would soon force her to make a mistake. She was convinced Simone would try to move the body. So, under the cover of darkness, while Simone was fitfully sleeping, a plainclothes officer from the Alpharetta PD crept up her driveway. With a quiet click, he attached a small magnetic GPS tracking device to the undercarriage of Simone's Lexus SUV. From that moment on, her every move was monitored in real time. Simone felt the net drawing tighter. She could feel the shift in the air, the cold finality of her situation. The police hadn't come back, but the silence was more terrifying than another visit. She knew they were building a case. She knew the freezer in her basement was a ticking time bomb. The temporary reprieve was over. She had to get him out of the house. She had to get rid of the body for good. Her mind, sharpened by days of fear, began to formulate a new, desperate plan, a final gamble. She would stage a car accident, a tragic story of a distraught husband, reeling from his diagnosis and the collapse of his marriage, driving off a mountain road in the middle of a storm. It was risky, insane even, but it was her only option. Staying put meant certain capture. She didn't know that her every move was now a blip on a screen in a police surveillance van. She didn't know that Detective Hayes was simply waiting, patiently, for her to lead them to Andre's final resting place. The decision was made. Tonight, she would move the body. Tonight, she would drive her husband to his grave. Unaware of the electronic eyes watching her, Simone began to prepare for the final, gruesome act of her crime, believing she was taking control of her destiny, when in reality, she was walking directly into the center of Detective Hayes' perfectly laid trap. The night was moonless and heavy, the air thick with the promise of a storm. It was perfect. Simone moved with a feverish energy, every action precise and planned. This was her last chance, her one and only shot at a life that wasn't behind bars. The first step was retrieving Andre's sedan. She had hidden it a few days after the murder on a quiet tree-lined street in a neighboring subdivision, a place where no one would notice an extra car. Dressed in black, a baseball cap pulled low over her face, she slipped out of her house and walked the 2 miles under the cloak of darkness. The car started without a problem. She drove it back and parked it on her street, just out of sight of her own driveway. Then came the part she had been dreading, the basement. The hum of the freezer was a monstrous sound now, the soundtrack to her damnation. She took a deep breath, opened the lid, and was hit by a blast of frigid air and the faint, sweet smell of decomposition that had been haunting her for days. Andre's body was a solid frozen block, wrapped in the blood-stained blanket and contorted into the shape of the freezer. Getting him out was a horrific struggle. He was impossibly heavy and inflexible. She had to turn the freezer off and wait for nearly an hour, a nerve-wracking eternity, for the body to thaw just enough to become pliable. The sounds of the partial defrosting, the pops and cracks of ice crystals, the subtle shift of limbs, would haunt her nightmares forever. She had laid out a large, heavy-duty tarp on the basement floor. With a final, desperate heave, she managed to pull the body out of the freezer. It landed on the tarp with a dull, wet thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. She worked quickly, her stomach churning. She wrapped him in the tarp, creating a tight, waterproof cocoon, securing it with an entire roll of duct tape. The resulting bundle was large, cylindrical, and horrifyingly body-shaped. Now, she had to get it out of the basement and into her own car. She couldn't drag it up the stairs. Instead, using a combination of leverage and pure, adrenaline-fueled strength, she managed to maneuver the heavy bundle up the stairs, step by agonizing step. It was a slow, exhausting process. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. Her muscles burned, and her back screamed in protest. By the time she reached the top, she was gasping for air, her body trembling with exertion. She dragged the bundle through the kitchen and out the back door into the garage. Her Lexus SUV was waiting, the back hatch open. Loading him in was the final, Herculean task. She had to lift one end onto the bumper, then shove and roll the dead weight into the cargo space. When the bundle was finally inside, she slammed the hatch shut and leaned against the car, her chest heaving, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She drove out of her garage and down the street to where Andre's sedan was parked. The street was silent, a perfect picture of suburban slumber. Under the dim glow of a single streetlight, she began the transfer. It was a clumsy, frantic process. Opening both trunks, she wrestled the tarp-wrapped body from her SUV and tried to force it into the smaller trunk of the sedan. It barely fit. She had to jam it in, the tarp groaning in protest. Just as she was trying to force the trunk lid closed, a pair of headlights turned the corner. Simone froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A car, moving slowly, was coming right towards her. It was a beat-up Toyota, the kind used for late-night food deliveries, or, even worse, a newspaper route. For a terrifying second, the car's headlights washed over her, illuminating the gruesome scene. A woman in black, straining to close a trunk that was clearly overstuffed with a large, dark object. She was caught. It was over. But the car didn't slow down. The driver, likely a tired teenager on a monotonous route, didn't even seem to glance her way. The car continued past her and disappeared around the next bend. Simone stayed frozen for a full minute, her body trembling with a fresh wave of adrenaline. It had been too close, way too close. With renewed urgency, she threw all her weight onto the trunk lid. It resisted, then finally latched with a loud, definitive click. It was done. Andre's body was in his own car, ready for its final journey. She quickly got into her Lexus, drove it back into her garage, and then walked back to the sedan. She got behind the wheel, the keys feeling alien in her hand. The cabin still held the faint scent of his cologne, a ghostly remnant of the man she had killed. Taking one last look at her quiet, dark house, she put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading north toward the mountains, and what she prayed would be her salvation. The city lights of Alpharetta receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, winding roads that led to the North Georgia mountains. As if on cue, the promised storm began, a light drizzle quickly escalating into a steady, driving rain. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, rhythmic tattoo, struggling to keep up. It was perfect. The weather would explain the accident. A slick road, poor visibility. Simone drove with a preternatural calm, her hands steady on the wheel. She obeyed every traffic law, never going a single mile over the speed limit. The last thing she needed was to be pulled over. The road climbed higher, the suburban landscape giving way to dense forests that pressed in on either side of the road. The world became a tunnel of wet asphalt illuminated by her headlights. She thought she was alone, a ghost driving a dead man's car through a storm. She had no idea that a few miles behind her, two unmarked police vehicles were following without their lights on. She didn't know that Detective Hayes was in the lead car, watching a blinking dot on a laptop screen that tracks Simone's every turn. "She's heading for Route 19, Hayes said to her partner, her voice calm. "Just as we profiled, she's looking for a remote spot to ditch the car." As Simone navigated a particularly dark stretch of highway, a sudden flash of blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. A patrol car. Out here? In this weather? Her mind raced. Had the paperboy called it in after all? Was this it? Following the law, she slowed down and pulled over onto the wet shoulder. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unbuckle her seatbelt. She rolled down the window, and a state trooper, his face obscured by the brim of his rain hat, approached her car. "Evening, ma'am," he said, shining his flashlight into the car, carefully avoiding her eyes. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Your left taillight is out. In this rain, that's a serious hazard. Folks can't see you." A taillight. Relief, so potent it almost made her laugh, washed over her. It wasn't about the body. He didn't know. "Oh, I'm so sorry, officer. This is my husband's car. I didn't realize. License and registration, please." She fumbled through the glove compartment, her hands slick with nervous sweat, and produced the documents. The trooper looked them over, his flashlight beam dancing across the paper. "Andre Dubois. Is he with you?" "No, officer. I'm just taking his car to be serviced in the morning." The lie came easily. The trooper handed her documents back. "Well, you tell him to get that light fixed. I'm just giving you a warning tonight, given the weather. Drive safe now." He tipped his hat and walked back to his cruiser. Simone waited until he had pulled back onto the highway and disappeared before she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had survived. She had looked into the face of the law and walked away. The close call emboldened her. She was going to make it. She drove for another 30 minutes, climbing higher into the mountains until she found the spot from her research. It was a sharp, hairpin turn with a flimsy-looking guardrail. Beyond it was a steep, rocky ravine that disappeared into the darkness. This was the place. She pulled the car over, about 100 feet before the turn, and killed the engine. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof. This was the final step. She would put the car in neutral, release the brake, get out, and push. She took a moment, her hand on the door handle, gathering her courage. She could almost feel a future, a life beyond this night. A life of medication and doctor's appointments, but a life nonetheless. A free life. She stepped out of the car, the cold rain instantly soaking her. She walked around to the driver's side door, ready to release the brake and give the car its final push toward the cliff edge. She placed her hand on the cold metal. And then the night erupted, not with a single pair of headlights, but with half a dozen. Searchlights from unseen vehicles burst through the rain, pinning her in their intersecting beams. The entire mountainside was lit up like a movie set. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, shattered the silence, echoing off the wet rocks. "Simone Dubois! This is the Alpharetta Police Department. Do not move. You are surrounded." She froze, blinded, her heart stopping in her chest. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, clad in tactical gear, weapons drawn, and at the front of them, walking calmly into the glare of the headlights, was Detective Renee Hayes. Her face was set, grim and utterly triumphant. Simone's desperate gamble had failed. She hadn't been driving toward salvation. She had been driving right into the jaws of the trap. Pinned in the crossfire of a dozen high-beam headlights, Simone didn't run. There was nowhere to run. The forest on one side, a cliff on the other, and a wall of law enforcement in front of her. The fight was over. The adrenaline that had sustained her for days vanished, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and an empty, hollow ache. The rain plastered her hair to her face, washing away the dirt and the fury, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of what she had become. Detective Hayes approached, her expression unreadable in the strobing lights. She didn't have her gun drawn. She didn't need it. Simone's posture, the slump of her shoulders, the way her head hung low, was a confession in itself. "It's over, Simone," Hayes said, her voice clear and steady above the storm. Simone looked up, her eyes meeting the detective's. She saw no malice there, no gloating. Just a weary professionalism, and perhaps a flicker of sorrow for the woman Simone could have been. "How?" Simone whispered, the word barely audible. "How did you know?" "The GPS tracker on your SUV told us you visited this car tonight," Hayes explained calmly. "The neighbor's security camera confirmed you moved a large, heavy object from your house. We've been following you since you left your driveway." She gestured to the sedan. "We know he's in the trunk, Simone." Every lie, every meticulous step of her cover-up had been unraveled. There was nothing left to hide behind. A strange sense of peace, cold and heavy, settled over her. The burden of the secret, a weight far heavier than her husband's body, was finally lifted. As an officer came forward with handcuffs, Simone began to speak, her voice quiet but clear. "I did it," she said, not just to Hayes, but to the storm, to the mountains, to the ghost of her husband. "I killed him." Hayes stopped the officer with a raised hand, her focus entirely on Simone. "Is that a confession, Mrs. Dubois?" Simone nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the rain on her cheek. "Yes, I killed him. He gave me HIV. He came home on my birthday, my 45th birthday, and smiled while he told me he had signed my death warrant. He wasn't sorry. He sneered at me." The words poured out of her, a torrent of pain and rage held back for too long. "He pushed me, and I snapped. I never wanted this. I loved him." Detective Hayes listened, her expression unchanging, as Simone's story tumbled out into the rainy night. When she was finished, a profound silence fell over the scene, broken only by the sound of the rain and Simone's quiet sobs. "Simone Dubois," Hayes said, her voice formal now. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. As the officer finally clicked the cold steel of the handcuffs around her wrists, Simone didn't feel like a criminal being captured. She felt like a patient finally receiving a diagnosis. The uncertainty was over. The running was done. They led her to a police car, the journey of a few yards feeling like the longest walk of her life. She took one last look at Andre's sedan, sitting precariously close to the edge of the cliff, a monument to her failed escape. The rain continued to fall, washing the mountain road clean, but it could not wash away the blood on her hands or the disease in her veins. Simone Dubois' story is not a simple one of good versus evil. It's a tragedy born from the layered poisons of betrayal, disease, and desperation. Andre's infidelity and reckless disregard for Simone's life planted a seed of justifiable rage. But the story serves as a stark and brutal reminder that the choices we make in response to our deepest wounds are what truly define our fate. In her moment of blinding fury, Simone chose violence over justice, secrecy over truth. That single, irrevocable act set her on a path where every subsequent choice, the lies, the cover-up, the gruesome attempts to hide her crime, only dug her deeper into a grave of her own making. The same methodical intelligence that made her an excellent nurse also made her a chillingly effective criminal, but it could not protect her from the consequences. Her story is a lesson in the catastrophic power of a secret. The weight of what she had done, compounded by the secret of her diagnosis, crushed her spirit long before the police ever found her. In the end, betrayal may have started the fire, but it was her own actions that burned her life to the ground. The final bitter irony is that in trying to escape one sentence, she guaranteed herself another, trading a life of managing a disease for a life confined by prison walls, forever haunted by a single, stormy night on a mountain precipice.